Okay, so one of the readings for this week was by Zerubbabel, Evietar Zerubbabel. It's a terrific kind of overview reading that really gives you a concrete sense of what I've kind of been going on and on about for the last half hour. Zerubbabel shows us that each society has its own logic of classification, so its own system of classification, which is usually invisible to people in the societies. In other words, it feels natural, it feels logical, it feels right. Those are all words that give us a sense of how fundamental classification is, because remember, in a Durkheimian sense, it ties back into the deepest social moments of social ritual and also things that we learn from an early age. And classification is society's, in some ways, projection of itself into this sacred and profane distinction process. So Zerubbabel shows us these things, and that the reasons, and this is important, Zerubbabel helps us to understand that the reasons societies often give for why things are classified as they are is not the same as our own sociological understanding of why classifications happen. And this is an important point to understand. You can get this, for example, by even watching, for example, today, clearly important public topic is battle over homosexuality today. So there's a ton of now scientific evidence about, say, parts of our biology that suggest potential sexual orientations. And there's lots of evidence from social scientists, especially sociologists, about the ways that individuals over the course of a lifespan may navigate sexuality. And so sexuality might change, and sexuality can be on a spectrum for people between what you might call pure hetero or pure homosexuality, that there can be this spectrum. And the fact that there are these fights over in public debates over whether sexuality is natural or whether it's socially constructed gives us a good sense that this is a classification process that's being exposed. It's kind of ruptured from essentially a century or almost millennial long tradition of homosexuality being something that wasn't even talked about, something that was oftentimes considered kind of perverse or something unnatural. We can see that that classification system has been exploded, and so what would have been talked about, say, even 30 or 40 years ago as a legitimate system built on nature, we now or I should say the heterosexual system of dominance would have been talked about as natural, something based in nature and clearly right. We now understand sexuality very differently. And by the fact that there are these different ways of talking about it, different ways of arguing about it. So for example, saying, hey, there's scientific evidence that people can have different sexual orientations. That's increasingly an argument that's run up against other forces in the country that want to say, no, that's not the proper way to think about the homosexuality. It's not about science and nature. No, instead, it's about, for example, say, biblical text or the way things have always been done in our community or society. So this kind of conflict, thinking in some of the spirit of Zerubbabel, helps you to see that for long stretches of time, classification of something, in this example sexuality, is just taken for granted. It is the way it is, and it's in moments of great conflict like this that we can actually see that classification systems are not totally arbitrary, because they're actually connected to a society and deep aspects of that society. But at the same time, these classification systems, while not totally arbitrary, at least are relative in some way, because they're different between societies. And Zerubbabel gives us some great examples of that, and we can think of some more examples, even within our own society, of classification at work. So for example, there was an era where women's work meant something. Now, meant one thing, I should say. Now, actual occupations where women work today are there's tons more places where women work today that they didn't work 50 years ago, which just goes to show you that that phrase women's work was a classification process at an earlier time, dividing a binary, men, women, a binary system of classification, very Durkheim, but it shows you how classification systems transform as societies transform, and that the arguments that would have been used in an earlier era to clearly show the truth of this is men's work, that's women's work, those arguments are born of social processes and not kind of universal or true in any sort of founding from the beginning of time sort of way. Here's another classification thing, and Zerubbabel talks a little bit about this. He talks about drugs. So at one point, cocaine was prescribed as a legitimate medication and was even a part of Coca-Cola early in the 20th century. But yet now we have a bright line where it's marked cocaine as over here, pushed it in kind of into a profane category. So moved it from a kind of the sacred in the binary system of prescribed by doctors, totally legitimate, and pushed it over into the profane. Now nothing has changed about cocaine itself, if we're still talking about the same cocaine system, substance, but instead the classification system, the way we understand and the way we want to put cocaine into a certain spot, that's what's changed. As Zerubbabel points out, border disputes, as he calls them, are great places to take a look at classification systems. So for an example, in this country, we're having huge debates right now about what is church, what is state, what is religion, what is politics. Or we're having debates right now about what is marriage for. Is marriage about equal rights? Primarily about equal rights for people to be able to marry the other person, no matter the sex, so that they can also have access to all sorts of federal rights and labor rights? Or is marriage only about procreation? So Zerubbabel helps us to see in these border disputes, so in these places where these, as I mentioned with homosexuality, where these kind of clashes of different arguments, those are perfect places to see that classification systems are being struggled over and they're unstable. And because, as I started off talking about in the lecture, because societies don't like these liminal, kind of unclear, unclassified period, these border disputes are places where classification is trying to be redone, and oftentimes entails a lot of conflict. So now let me get to our last topic here today. One of the great social scientists to follow in the footsteps of Emile Durkheim, and this person died, she died just a few years ago, was a woman by the name of Mary Douglas. And one of her great contributions was to help us understand better this thing called symbolic pollution. Now, symbolic pollution refers to when people run afoul of social order. So when somebody has violated a taboo, whatever that taboo, whether it's a primitive society that Durkheim talked about, or whether it's our own day and age, when anybody has violated a taboo, they are polluted. They're symbolically polluted. In other words, they've run afoul of the binary, sacred, profane, symbolic structuring system, and they are seen by a social group as polluted. And what Mary Douglas helped us to understand was that so much of what goes on, even in our own social world, is really about keeping order and keeping order of the sacred and profane, and trying to avoid running afoul of symbolic pollution. And Mary Douglas showed that there are certain parts or times or places in society where beliefs about symbolic pollution are particularly strong as a way to give order to these places or times of society, and that rituals to either try and prevent symbolic pollution or to try and clean symbolic pollution away grow. And so what are some of these places? Well, one places where we're likely to find symbolic pollution beliefs are in what she called ill-defined situations. Now, a classic on this would be, particularly in the past, she wrote a lot of this in the 1960s in particular, would be places where relationships are not legalized. So in which legality is not clear. So for example, we now in our society have really strong symbolic pollution beliefs about the age of 18. So boom, at the age of 18, all of a sudden somebody can give sexual consent. Now, because on either sides of those, if a couple is on either sides of those, we see that as kind of a either sexually perverse or at least kind of a disordered situation. At least that's the way our society talks about it now. Because of that, that line of 18 is a very strong line. So that particular marking of symbolic pollution, that 18-year-old line, is a great example of an ill-defined situation that has become defined by a symbolic pollution belief. Another place where we would expect to see symbolic pollution beliefs emerge is where social institutions cannot control behavior easily. So let me give you an example of this. Universities like ours make a big deal about this thing we call academic dishonesty. And one of the reasons we make a big deal about academic dishonesty, not just because it violates our sense, well, actually, yes, because it violates our sense of individual creativity and the fact that individuals, for their own creative work they do, should be given note for that. Because academic dishonesty violates that so strongly. Every university has really strong, serious codes about academic dishonesty. If you run afoul of academic dishonesty, in this class, for example, it literally could lead to your expulsion from the university. Now, there are a number of different stages or different penalties that can be given to academic dishonesty, but it's such a big deal because in the creation of our ideas and the papers we write and the online discussions we do and the tests that we take, especially on an online environment where it's hard to know who's cheating or if somebody's trying to take a test right next to somebody else and sharing answers, because it's such a situation where this university, this social institution cannot control your behavior, then this symbolic pollution belief is huge. So academic dishonesty is a particularly big thing for us because it's not easy to control, and we try and enforce it, and we try and talk about rules of it specifically to try and control it, even though we know it's a hard thing to control. And finally, we also see symbolic pollution beliefs arise in a society during these transitional or liminal states. And I've already said quite a bit about this, but I just wanted to make clear again, for example, in our idea about kind of teenagers or about the change from day to night, we oftentimes consider those strange periods that are kind of polluted in a way. These people in this teenage period or this change from day to night aren't normal, or aren't, in the case of teenagers, aren't fully done growing, or are prone to make all sorts of mistakes. That's a great example of kind of a symbolic pollution belief. We think that they're going to run afoul of things, and so therefore we try and kind of cage in those spaces, call it sunset, try to turn on the lights and go indoors, or in the case of youth, call it teenager, and try and contain them from mucking up too much of themselves in our society. So these are all places, all conditions where society will use symbolic pollution beliefs and rituals to try and keep social order. Let me pause. I'll come back for the last part.